Hey guys, Danny Johnson here, and today we're looking at the T56 Magnum for the 0304 Cobra or New Edge, the TUET11010, and what we're going to be looking at is the pivot ball stud length and also the clutch fork clearancing. So in the video we're going to talk about the stock clutch fork and how it sits on the transmission, and then some notching that we did in order to help with clearance with the extra webbing that the T56 Magnum has. So you can see it's a little bit thicker in some spots, and it has been factory notched, but we'll see if that's enough. So why do we have to do this? Well, if you look at the distance between the stock clutch and the bell housing, that distance shortens when you go to a twin disc or a bigger clutch. So it really depends on which clutch you have. So what that means is we might have to move our throwout bearing assembly back 5 millimeters, or it could be contacting the diaphragm fingers before the transmission's even fully in place. Some people have gone to install the transmission and that throwout bearing already is smashing against those diaphragm fingers. So stock, we have about 25 millimeters of space from the retainer sleeve to the throwout bearing. After we've done all the notching, we've gained about 5 millimeters doing that. So notching the clutch fork is one option to get that throwout bearing farther away from the diaphragm fingers so it's not already hitting when the transmission's installed. Now the pivot ball stud is another way that we can do that by shortening it, and it changes the swing on how the clutch fork is going to swing with that too. Luckily, both the Magnum and the stock T56 that I see are both 30 millimeters in depth on how far they've been drilled. So switching over to the McLeod adjustable pivot ball stud should be able to get us that 5 millimeters as well. The part number we used was 16912 on the stock T56. By swapping to the adjustable pivot ball stud from McLeod, you can see it comes in naturally a little bit shorter, actually almost that exact space of 5 millimeters that we needed. So we'll go ahead and get started and show you the process of doing both. So keep in mind again, it depends on which clutch you have, how far it comes out. So you're going to need to be doing your measurements so that you know how far your clutch is coming out, if you have a twin disc, if you have a single disc, how thick that ends up being. Also the flywheel and its thickness. Sometimes there's adapter plates for McLeods that they buy, so you use your stock flywheel, and that might even affect the thickness. So you're going to have to do your measurements and see where it's contacting. So pay attention to the video, and if you have questions, put them down in the comments. So in this video we're going to cover the pivot ball stud length and the throwout bearing length, and so it's important to take some measurements. We've basically put a straight edge across the bell housing, and as we measure from the bell housing down to the diaphragm fingers, that's the distance that we want to know. The factory pivot ball stud will be set up for the factory depth of the clutch, or how far it comes in. So when you change to, for example, a twin disc clutch like this RXT from McLeod, then that clutch system will come out farther. It's a thicker clutch, and so we have to adjust the pivot ball to accommodate that. So with the factory pivot ball stud, this is the amount of travel that we get, and as you see, the throwout bearing makes it pretty much all the way to the end of the retainer sleeve before there's any sort of binding, because this is swinging like a door, not coming straight out. So eventually it will stop pushing straight and start to bind. Now this is with the pivot ball shortened. You can see our range is different now. We're starting farther back, and it won't go all the way to the end without a little bit of binding, because again, we're swinging it and eventually it stops pushing straight. So our goal is to adjust the pivot ball stud so that it's in deep enough where the throwout bearing won't hit the clutch too soon and you can't even get the transmission on, but it's also out far enough that we get the proper swing. And so in the end, we want to have this amount of play right here, because the diaphragm fingers will grow as the clutch wears. So you want a little bit of wiggle room. We ended up with about 3 millimeters, so that as that clutch grows, you're not stuck with the throwout bearing not able to retract. Now, of course, we won't have that much slop in the end. We're going to use our firewall adjuster to adjust that slack out of it when it's all done, but we want to have that room to grow. So with the new clutch installed, now we're going to want to take our same measurements from the diaphragm fingers to the bell housing. And remember, if you're measuring on one side of the ruler, we need to subtract this amount or try to get a better measurement. So this one works pretty good, 48.25 millimeters if we're going from the diaphragm fingers up until we get to the back of the ruler. It's a little bit more wobbly that way, kind of harder to get a reading. So 53.35 or so was the factory one. So what we're going to do is look at those two numbers, and in this case this is going to be a difference of about 5.1 millimeters. The new clutch comes out farther than the old one. So we're going to work with some adjustability on this using the pivot ball stud. And so here's the factory one. And as you can see, it wears out at the top. You can get some clutch vibration from that, so it needed to be replaced anyway. But if you look at the stock modular pivot ball, it's huge, so it won't work. The one that we have factory is from the T56, and the one we're using today is the McLeod 16912. And so if you look, it's the exact same length overall for the stud, but the adjustable jam nut is how we're going to be able to change how far in this pivot ball stud can go compared to the other one. Now, measuring the pivot ball stud from the factory, we're getting a pretty good reading here of about 37.11 millimeters. And so now that we have that measurement, we can take our 7/8 inch socket and we're going to put it all the way over the pivot ball stud. You could use an open end wrench too. It's very easy on the T56 with the flat case without the bell housing. Some transmissions it's harder to get a wrench angled in there. So we're going to go ahead and remove this after we have that measurement, and we're going to check the depth of the threads. The T56 Magnum apparently doesn't go in as far, so you might have to cut your pivot ball stud down if you need it to get any shorter. So as with the stock T56, we're looking at about 30 millimeters is how far that threads will go. Now here it is on the T56 Magnum. It did come in at 30 millimeters once again, so they may have deepened it from other complaints, or maybe the casing's just thicker, but it's the same 30 millimeters deep. So, that's deeper than what the factory pivot ball has as far as the threads, as you can see. And so we're just going to set these down and kind of take some comparisons. And check the video description because I'm going to make a video that's every measurement that I took, which was a lot of measurements. But what we're going to do now is take our new adjustable pivot ball stud and we're going to thread this one in. Now when it's all said and done, we will use Loctite and bolt down that jam nut. So this is just for test fitting. So we'll just put this in all the way and then tighten down that jam nut, and eventually we'll do that with a wrench. With that said, now it's in as far as it can, and we're going to put the old bolt up there or take measurements using our caliper again. But as you can see, the adjustable pivot ball comes in just a little bit more than the factory one when it's all the way threaded in. So when we compare these two measurements, the factory pivot ball stud came in at 37.11 millimeters, and the new one, when it's installed all the way in, came in at almost 6 millimeters shorter than the other one. So the reading we got was 31.13. So that's going to help us because that's going to be helping bring the throwout bearing assembly away from the deeper clutch that we have now installed. So here's the factory ones just to look at. There's no way that other one would work. And everybody wants a short answer of how long should the pivot ball stud be, but what you're going to see in this video is you have to take measurements to find out, because it does matter depending on which transmission you have, how thick your clutch is, which flywheel you're running, if it's the regular T56, if it's the T56 Magnum and its case differences, everything like that. So with that said, I have seen on research that people have gone 5 millimeters shorter all the way up to 12 millimeters shorter to make this fit, depending on transmission and clutch type. One other side note, if you do end up having to cut the actual bolt down, the length of it has to be at least the width of the bolt for it to be a strong bolt, or it will lose its integrity. So make sure that the length, when you're all done, if you've had to cut it way down, that it can thread into the transmission at least how wide the bolt is as well. So this is the Valvoline Moly Fortified Gray Grease. This is good stuff to use for these components. As you see, it has a drop point of 500 degrees Fahrenheit. On the retainer sleeve, that's the next part that we want to grease, so we're just greasing that up. The clutch fork does have some grease where the pivot ball stud goes, but we're going to add a little bit more. So we're going to slide our clutch fork on, and then we're going to make sure to grease the pivot ball stud as well. And so we're going to go ahead and just push this up and it clicks into place. Make sure that you have some nice swing here. And so the next thing we're going to look at is our swing. Since we have shortened the pivot ball stud, it affects the way that this clutch fork will swing. If you look at the way it swings, it's almost like a door. So at one point, it will no longer be pushing that throwout bearing straight. It will start to bind up. So you can put a mark on your new pivot ball stud and adjust it. I like to go maybe one revolution at a time and then tighten down the jam nut, and then take measurements and see how it swings. Now we don't have to have it swing all the way to the front because our clutch is deeper, and so we're going to be contacting the clutch first. But you do want to take measurements, as I'll show you what we did a little bit later, and make sure that you're going to be within range where you're going to get a full travel on that clutch fork. So to show you physically as an example, our diaphragm fingers to bell housing was about 48.25 millimeters. So if we take 48.25 millimeters and we go from the case outward, that's where the clutch is going to basically be. And so we need to make sure that our throwout bearing can be retracted far enough that it's not hitting those clutch fingers as we're installing the transmission. So for this measurement, we went straight up from the throwout bearing in the fully retracted position and measured the case to the throwout bearing. And we came out at about 45.10 millimeters. So where we were 48 millimeters from the case to the diaphragm fingers, then that means we have plenty of room and we're not going to be contacting our throwout bearing and diaphragm fingers before the transmission's installed. Now by comparison with the T56 Magnum, the distance with the stock pivot ball is that 48 millimeters. So right now, as it sits, even with a little notching, which we'll show you later in the video, we could barely get it to where it would be touching the diaphragm fingers of the clutch as it's installed. So we will have to shorten that pivot ball stud and possibly also do some clearancing.
Okay, T56 Magnum with a stock clutch fork. They have made some provisions, it looks like, where they've notched it out for the clutch fork to go back a little bit more. Note where it appears that they have notched it from the factory for that clutch fork here and here. So we're going to get some measurements of what that's like stock, and then also how we have notched this out to go past some of this webbing and go in a little bit farther. So it looks like we're right about 25 millimeters for this depth here from the retainer sleeve to the throwout bearing. Okay, we were able to increase that up to 30 from 25 with notching the clutch fork. Now using McLeod's adjustable pivot ball stud, if it works like it did on the other car, that alone would give us about 5 millimeters difference, or 6, so you may not even have to notch it, or maybe a combination of two, being that the T56 Magnum does have thicker webbing. All right, still playing with Play-Doh even at this age, I guess. We're gonna put it on the back side here and see where our contact is made. Go ahead and put our clutch fork back on. Okay, so now give it a little bit of a contact here. Okay, so if we wanted full travel out of this, to go a little bit more, we can see it's hitting the bolt here too on the top. It's hitting right about here on the webbing. Okay, so here's the impressions that were made from the bolt there. And also you can see on the webbing, those directions, both of those. So it's basically just the webbing here and that top bolt. Okay, so now I'm gonna take this knife here and I'm gonna cut and leave behind where these marks are, so that we have it exposed everywhere it's not, and then we can kind of make some marks on the back of the clutch fork. Okay, so I'm just going to cut with a razor and remove everywhere except for where it made contact. Okay, so this is what the clutch fork looks like. We'll want to clearance it here, coming down on that angle there, on this side back there and here, so we can mark this with a Sharpie. And this thing here, and you might just say, well, I'll just take this whole thing out. And maybe you can, but that's gonna give you some structure problems. We don't want this fork to bend. Okay, so we basically just kind of put paint around the Play-Doh, so when we remove the Play-Doh, we'll know the area to cut. Okay, so basically as we remove this, we're gonna wanna kind of cut right from there to there. We're gonna wanna cut from here to here. We're gonna clearance between those two. Okay, and then we can draw a circle on this one too. Okay, and we just cut around this, and so that's kind of our area to cut that with maybe like a hole saw or something. Okay, 13mm socket here. Okay, and we're just gonna take this off, and we're gonna drill it out right there. Okay, so this is what we kind of want to drill out. This is a hole saw, so it has a drill bit in the end of it to help pilot it. And then it's gonna basically drill down in a circle. So if you want to see more on how that works, I'll put a video in the description where you can get these, but we're gonna go ahead. We have safety glasses on, and we're gonna just start drilling. Okay, as you can see, it's already drilling very easily. It's pretty soft metal. Okay, just used one of these bits here to kind of smooth it out just so that it looks a little more uniform. We can clean it up more too after we test fit. Okay, another note on clearancing, even when you're taking this off of the backside here and you're cutting it so it's not hitting the webbing anywhere here, you're always going to be hitting a high point. So you'll grind it down, and then when you put this here, you might be hitting here, so you grind that down. Then the next thing you know, that's making a hit here or the other side. So just know that about the clearancing. You can see what this ended up looking like to get it to miss all the webbing, to miss those bolts, and get it really far back.
So stock, we have about 25 millimeters of space from the retainer sleeve to the throwout bearing. After we've done all the notching, we've gained about 5 millimeters doing that. So notching the clutch fork is one option to get that throwout bearing farther away from the diaphragm fingers so it's not already hitting when the transmission's installed. Okay, so here's what the notching looked like when it was all said and done. Now, first of all, this dampener, as you can see, we had to even notch it more. So rather than grind it all down, in the end, we just had this removed. Now, you can put this piece on and off of the car with the transmission installed, so that makes it nice to at least do that if you have to. But we had to go down even deeper. So this is what the notching looked like to get across that webbing that's on the front of the transmission on the Magnum on both sides compared to a stock one. So you can see it's quite a significant amount. Now, hopefully, you might not have to do this at all if you change to the adjustable pivot ball stud. Okay, this is the McLeod part number that we've already covered. Okay, if you change to that one and it already does what you need to get, you know, your extra 5 millimeters shorter, and that works with your twin disc clutch and everything that you're using, you may not have to do this. But you might have to do this, and the pivot ball stud might have to be a combination of both. It really just depends on what clutch and flywheel you have, and you know, there's a lot of variables, so there's no short answer. But again, you can try notching this one out and have it removed, but it is nice to have this dampener to give it a little bit more structural integrity. You don't want this clutch fork bending or twisting. But anyway, that's what the notching might look like. And so you might want to consider notching it out, and then that way when it's all on the car, at least it's already notched. You may not need it notched, but it's better to have it than
have to pull the transmission again when you find out that it's, that.
So we can now see we have about 3 millimeters of clearance between where the diaphragm fingers will be and where the clutch fork will be in its fully retracted position. So what this is going to look like on the car, as an example, you can see when it's installed, we have just enough movement. And so if we wanted to, we could move the pivot ball in or out to adjust this if we're too close or too far away. Remember, the diaphragm fingers will start to spread out as the clutch wears, so you don't want to have it completely tight. You want to have a little bit of a gap there for it to grow into as well. You don't want to have it so you can't adjust the throwout bearing and it's stuck against the diaphragm finger. So just make sure you're getting accurate measurements from the face of the throwout bearing up to the case, and then from the case to the diaphragm fingers, which would be the bell housing to diaphragm fingers, and just make sure that you're going to have that gap. So you can see we got our 3 millimeter gap here. That's going to be perfect. As you saw when it was installed, we had just a little bit of movement forward and back on the diaphragm fingers to the throwout bearing, which is what we want. McLeod says it takes 445 thousandths, or basically half of an inch, to disengage the clutch. So basically what we want to do is look at that measurement and make sure that our clutch travel is going to be enough. Now, starting farther back on the retainer sleeve, it shouldn't be a problem. If we were starting forward, we'd be afraid that the throwout bearing would come off of the retainer sleeve. So for us, it's about binding, when it's going to bind up, and deciding if you want to bring that pivot ball stud out or in more. Here's the factory swing. As you can see, it brings it all the way to the end. And so with the new pivot ball in place, you can see how it basically just stops that swing a little bit shorter. So we shouldn't need it to go all the way to the end, or we'll be overextending that diaphragm fingers on the clutch. So it's okay for it to start a little bit farther back, and it's okay if it starts to bind right at the very end. So from our measurements, and this was the travel that was indicated down at the clutch fork, it was 1.235 inches of travel is what it took for the clutch to fully engage on the stock system. So basically we're going to look at that amount and we're going to compare it to how much travel the clutch fork is going to make at the bottom of the clutch fork and how far that goes in, make sure it translates to our half of an inch, or our 445 thousandths. So basically, as we take the measurements down here, we came in right where we needed to be. We have full clutch disengagement, as you can see by the springs and everything that's working there. Another clutch diagram shows that the clutch fork should also be perfectly straight from the pivot ball straight down when it's in the retracted position. Now, since we're also changing geometry of how it swings and everything like that, it might not be perfect. So we are using aftermarket components and trying to get it to swing on a range it wasn't really designed for. So when you're happy with where it's at, make sure you do remember to go back and put your Loctite on and put your pivot ball stud in, and then tighten down that jam nut. We tightened it down nice and firm as well. And so just remember, with the T56 Magnum, you might have some differences in the case. It might not go in as deep. You might have to cut some threads. On the stock T56, this one worked out perfect. So for my application, I threaded my pivot ball stud all the way in, and that was about 6 millimeters, as you saw. Now, it could be different for yours, so don't just go off of my numbers, because the thickness of the flywheel, the difference in what clutch you're running, the transmission itself, it can all make differences. So just make sure that you are taking measurements and everything is coming out how it should before you install it. Of course, you want to have all the measurements right so you don't have to take the transmission off again. So in the end, again, you just want to make sure that that throwout bearing is going to have plenty of room when the clutch cable is disconnected, and then once it's connected, the throwout bearing is designed to constantly spin, just not with a lot of pressure on it. There are some things out here like this free play elimination kit that I have. This is old and discontinued, but what it basically does is just helps push that clutch fork backward, so when you let go of the clutch, there is some way of kind of taking the pressure off of the throwout bearing, but you do want it spinning. So you want it adjusted properly where you don't have too much pressure on the throwout bearing, and you want to make sure that you have enough clutch travel, because if you're starting farther back and you don't have full clutch travel, then it won't disengage. and you can get locked out between gears, and you can hurt the synchros if you're not fully disengaged as you're shifting gears. So this is just something we're kind of setting up as we're setting the throwout bearing distance. We're going to make sure if you hear that, it's just got the tiniest little click before it starts to engage, and so we can adjust that out with the firewall adjuster. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Check the video description. I'm going to put all the other videos that are similar to this or also related to this, as well as my Mustang Maintenance playlist. And if you're new to the channel, feel free to subscribe. Thanks, guys.